Mark Hensley had spent nearly 4 decades on the water, long enough to know the tides of the Maine coast like the lines on his hands. He was the kind of fisherman who didn't need to check the forecast to know what the day would bring. On the morning of September 14th, he left the harbor before most of the town was awake. A few other fishermen, loading gear onto their boats, remembered seeing him that morning. A brief wave, the glint of his yellow slicker in the pale pre-dawn light, and the steady hum of his engine fading into the distance. The water was calm, the sky just beginning to warm from black to blue, and there was nothing to suggest it would be anything other than a routine day on the water. By all accounts, Mark had every reason to come home that night. His cooler was packed, his nets were freshly mended, and his daughter's wedding was only weeks away. Friends said he'd been talking about it non-stop, even bringing photos of the venue to the dock to show other crew members. His route was predictable, heading out past the headland, then southeast toward one of his regular grounds, where haddock and pollock had been running strong that week. Around 10 a.m., another fisherman hailed him on the radio, asking how the catch was looking. Mark responded as he always did, clipped and direct, saying he'd had a slow start but would stay out for a few more hours. It was the last confirmed contact anyone had with him. By midday, repeated calls to his boat went unanswered. At first, no one thought much of it. Radios cut out all the time in certain spots, and Mark was known to get wrapped up in work and ignore chatter. But when he still hadn't checked in by late afternoon, not with the harbor, not with any friends, people began to worry. At 4:27 p.m., the harbor master logged the first official concern. The Coast Guard was notified, but with daylight fading, they decided to wait until the following morning to begin a full search. That night, a storm was predicted to move in from the south, though the sea remained glassy and calm as the sun went down. Mark's wife stayed up in their living room, lights on, expecting at any moment to hear the crunch of his tires in the gravel driveway. That moment never came. Just after sunrise the next day, a search boat spotted Mark's vessel drifting more than 12 miles from his intended route. The engine was still idling, low and steady, as if it had been left running for hours. His nets hung half-deployed over the stern, one corner trailing in the water. Inside the wheelhouse, nothing seemed overtly disturbed. His lunch sat untouched in its wrapper. His thermos, still warm to the touch, rested in its usual spot beside the controls. His weather jacket was hanging neatly on the hook. But Mark was nowhere to be found. A quick check revealed no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken equipment, no indications that anyone else had boarded. The deck was slick from spray, but no footprints led away from the cabin that didn't belong to him. His life vest, the one he always wore at sea, wasn't on board. Investigators considered the possibility that he had been adjusting the nets, lost his balance, and gone overboard. If that was the case, the odds of survival in the cold Atlantic were slim, even for a man as experienced as Mark. Still, certain details didn't sit right. The nets were positioned in a way that suggested he'd been in the middle of hauling them back in, not setting them. And the boat's location didn't match the natural drift patterns from his last known coordinates. It was as if it had been moved there, intentionally or otherwise. The controls were set to idle, not neutral, meaning someone had chosen to leave the engine running. By mid-morning, a missing person case was officially opened. The Coast Guard began canvassing the area with helicopters and patrol vessels, expanding the search grid every hour. Local fishermen volunteered their own boats to join in, crisscrossing the waters Mark knew better than anyone. The hope was to find something, a body, a life vest, even a scrap of clothing, that could explain where he had gone. But with each passing hour, the searchers saw nothing but endless blue water and the gentle roll of the swell. Mark's boat was towed back to shore and secured in the harbor under police supervision. His family gathered at the dock as it arrived, the sight of it without him both surreal and crushing. People stood in silence as the lines were tied off, the low thrum of the engine finally dying. Whatever had happened out there had happened quickly, leaving no call for help, no clear signs of trouble. And as the town tried to make sense of it, one truth was impossible to ignore. A man who had spent his life reading the ocean had disappeared into it without leaving a trace, and the calm waters where he'd last been seen now felt anything but safe. The morning after Mark's boat was towed back into harbor, The Coast Guard mobilized one of the largest local search efforts in recent memory. At first light, a pair of MH-60 Jayhawk helicopters swept out over the water, their rotors thundering against the stillness of the dawn. Beneath them, fast response patrol boats began methodically cutting through the search grid, a coordinated pattern designed to ensure no stretch of water went unchecked. Every available resource was committed, the urgency amplified by the knowledge that survival time in the cold Atlantic was measured in hours, not days. The first day brought a flicker of hope. Mid-morning, one of the patrol crews spotted something bobbing between the swells. When they hauled it aboard, they found Mark's faded green baseball cap, damp but intact. The stitching on the brim was frayed in a way his family immediately recognized. Not far from it, another boat recovered a silver thermos, the same one investigators had seen in the cabin the day before. Its lid was screwed on tight, keeping the contents surprisingly warm. Hours later, a third vessel retrieved an unopened pack of cigarettes, waterlogged but still holding its shape. All 3 items were cataloged and bagged as evidence before being sent to the forensics team. For the searchers, these discoveries were bittersweet. They were proof that Mark had been out there, tangible reminders of him, but they also suggested the worst. The fact that his life vest hadn't been found was troubling. If he had been wearing it, it should have been the most visible thing in the water, designed to float indefinitely. Its absence raised questions none of the crews wanted to voice aloud. Over the next 2 days, the operation intensified. Sonar-equipped vessels swept the sea floor, targeting drop-offs and reef edges where currents might have carried a body or debris. Divers were deployed around the larger reef structures, descending into the shadowy depths where visibility dropped to just a few feet. The underwater terrain was treacherous, with jagged coral outcroppings and shifting schools of fish, but there was no sign of Mark or any additional clues. Back on shore, the search's progress was relayed to waiting family members in careful, measured words. Mark's wife and daughter remained near the harbor each day, their eyes scanning the horizon whenever the whine of a helicopter approached. Friends from the fishing community gathered in small clusters along the pier, trading theories quietly, but always falling back into uneasy silence. The weather stayed almost unnaturally calm, the seas flat enough that some of the Coast Guard crew remarked on how little the waves had shifted since the day he vanished. The stability of the conditions made the lack of answers all the more baffling. There had been no storms, no heavy fog, no sudden squalls to explain a man being swept away without a trace. Veteran rescue personnel admitted, off the record, that cases like this, where the water is calm and the person experienced, were often the hardest to reconcile. The ocean was dangerous, yes, but it was also predictable in ways that Mark understood better than most. By the 4th day, the search grid had expanded far beyond Mark's intended route, pushing into deeper, colder waters. Helicopters burned through fuel, making long loops before heading back to refuel, only to return and repeat the same slow, meticulous sweeps. The patrol boats logged mile after mile, their crews leaning over the rails, scanning the endless blue for any hint of something out of place. But with each passing hour, the chances of recovery, alive or otherwise, diminished. On the evening of the 5th day, the Coast Guard commander called a briefing. With no new evidence, no sightings, and no body recovered, the official search was being suspended. Mark Hensley was now listed as missing at sea, the case to remain open but inactive unless new information came to light. It was a conclusion that left his family hollow. For them, the search's end wasn't closure. It was a doorway slammed shut with nothing on the other side. The crews returned to base, their decks empty, the recovered items locked away in evidence storage. Out on the water, the coordinates that had been so meticulously combed over the past week lay quiet again, the sun setting in long, streaked bands across the horizon. To an outside observer, nothing had changed. But for those who knew Mark, the sea no longer seemed like the same place. It had taken one of their own without a struggle, without a witness, and without a reason, leaving behind only a handful of floating belongings and a silence that no amount of searching could fill. In the days following the suspension of the search, the harbor town shifted into a strange kind of limbo. Boats still left each morning, engines rumbling in the dark, But conversations on the docks were quieter now, broken by long pauses as if people were thinking twice about what they said aloud. Mark Hensley's disappearance wasn't just news, it was a rupture in the rhythm of a place where most people could remember decades without losing a single local fisherman to the sea. And yet, he was simply gone. Speculation grew quickly, fueled by the absence of answers. Some clung to the simplest explanations. They pictured a sudden rogue wave, the kind that could rear up without warning even on calm days, pitching him overboard before he had a chance to react. Others suggested a medical emergency, a heart attack, a stroke that might have struck while he was hauling in the nets. In that version of events, the boat drifting miles from his intended route made sense. The current could have carried it there, engine idling all the while. But not everyone accepted those theories. The more days passed without a body, the more space there was for darker ideas. A few whispered that Mark might have wanted to vanish, that perhaps there were debts or personal troubles no one knew about. They spoke in low tones in bait shops and over drinks in the harbor bar, careful to keep their voices down when his friends or family were near. Mark's family rejected those suggestions outright. His wife was adamant. He was in good health, he had no reason to disappear, and he had been counting down the days to their daughter's wedding. She told anyone who would listen about the suit he had already picked up, the father-daughter dance he'd been rehearsing in the living room, awkward steps and all. His brother pointed out that Mark's accounts were in order, his bills paid, and his work schedule steady. If he had been planning to leave, there should have been some sign. The police dug into those possibilities with the same methodical approach they used in every missing person case. They subpoenaed his bank records, combing through transactions in the weeks before he vanished. No large withdrawals, no suspicious payments. Credit card charges showed fuel, groceries, fishing gear, nothing out of the ordinary. His phone records painted a similar picture, routine calls to suppliers, family, and a few friends, all ending before the day he left. There were no mysterious numbers, no sudden changes in behavior, no messages that hinted at a secret life. Even so, the lack of definitive evidence made it impossible to dismiss any scenario outright. Investigators couldn't prove he had met with foul play, but they couldn't rule it out either. They couldn't prove an accident, but they had no proof of intent. It left them, and everyone who knew Mark, trapped in an uneasy space between competing possibilities, none of them satisfying. In the fishing community, tension began to take on a sharper edge. Long-standing friendships grew strained over quiet disagreements about what had happened. Those who believed in a simple accident resented the insinuations that something more sinister had occurred. Those who suspected foul play or disappearance grew frustrated with what they saw as complacency, the unwillingness to question every detail. Some fishermen began avoiding the stretch of water where Mark's boat had been found, saying it didn't feel right to work there anymore. Others refused to change their routes, determined not to let superstition dictate their livelihood. The divide was subtle, but it was there, a change in who tied up next to whom, in which crews shared coffee before heading out, in the way eyes lingered just a little longer on boats leaving the harbor. For Mark's family, the days were measured by the arrival of the mail and the ring of the phone. Every knock at the door carried the weight of potential news, even though most visits were neighbors bringing meals or offering quiet company. The official investigation remained open, but without fresh leads, detectives could only revisit the same facts, the same interviews, and the same frustratingly thin case file. Hope and dread coexisted in every conversation about him. People wanted to believe he might still be alive somewhere, held up by some improbable set of circumstances, but they also knew that the ocean did not give back what it took without reason. In a place where the sea was both provider and threat, they had learned to live with loss, but never without an explanation. And Mark's absence was the kind that gnawed at the edges of certainty, a hollow space that no theory could fully fill. 2 weeks after the Coast Guard suspended their search, the talk around the harbor had started to quiet, the way conversations eventually do when there's nothing new to say. But that uneasy stillness shattered on a cold Tuesday morning when the crew of the Margaret Ann, a mid-sized trawler working the same general zone where Mark Hensley had last been seen, radioed in a catch that no one on board could make sense of. They had been hauling up their nets after a long night's run when the winch groaned under an unusual strain. At first, they thought they'd snagged an old crab pot or part of a wreck, not uncommon in waters that had seen generations of working boats. What broke the surface, though, made the deck fall silent. Twisted among seaweed and rusted metal debris was a jagged section of boat railing, its white paint scoured away in places by salt and barnacle growth. The section was bent at a sharp angle, as though it had been torn free with considerable force. More startling was what clung to it, a length of rope, knotted in an elaborate, almost decorative pattern that no one aboard recognized. The knots were tight and deliberate, not the hasty work of a fisherman securing gear. When the Margaret Ann docked later that morning, harbor police met the crew and secured the find. Within hours, forensic technicians were examining it in a secured yard, brushing away salt deposits and measuring each fragment. Initial testing confirmed the railing's paint composition, and fiber traces matched those from Mark's vessel. The rope, too, was a match for the synthetic line he kept on board, but the knotwork was foreign. Investigators brought in a local marine safety instructor to analyze it. He admitted he'd never seen anything like it outside of old maritime reference books. It was intricate in a way that suggested skill, possibly even a tradition, but it wasn't part of any modern fishing or docking practice along the Maine coast. The discovery prompted a series of uncomfortable questions. If the railing had been torn away during an accident, say, if Mark had been thrown against it in rough seas, the damage pattern should have matched known stress breaks from such incidents. But the tear marks didn't line up with that theory. The metal appeared to have been wrenched outward, not inward, and the paint around the break showed no signs of impact from the boat's own equipment. It was as if something had gripped it from outside and pulled. The rope added a layer of unease. Investigators debated whether it had been tied before or after the railing broke free. Some believed it might have been a hasty repair attempt, though the complexity of the knots argued against haste. Others speculated it could have been a means of securing the railing to something else entirely, which might explain how it ended up in deep water far from the main drift zone. When divers were dispatched to the coordinates where the Margaret Ann had been working, they found little beyond scattered debris and a silty seabed. There was no sign of the rest of the railing or any other large fragments from Mark's boat. That absence was troubling. If the section had broken away naturally, there should have been more nearby. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the fishing community, reigniting the theories that had been simmering since the disappearance. Some saw it as proof of foul play, a sign that another's vessel had been involved and that someone had tried to hide evidence in the deep. Others argued it could still be the result of an accident, pointing out that old equipment and structural fatigue could make any boat vulnerable under the right conditions. But even they struggled to explain the knots. For Mark's family, the find was another blow. It was physical proof that part of his boat had been destroyed, but it offered no comfort and no clear path to understanding what had happened to him. His wife sat in on one of the briefings, staring at photographs of the twisted metal and the rope until she finally pushed them away. She told a friend later that it felt like looking at a piece of him, broken, handled by strangers, pulled from a place he never should have been. Investigators logged the railing and rope into evidence storage after completing the initial analysis, though privately they admitted they didn't know what to do with it. The official report would note the unknown knot type, the unusual break pattern, and the confirmed material match to Mark's vessel. What it couldn't state was whether this was the result of an accident, a deliberate act, or something no one had yet imagined. That uncertainty hung over the case like a shadow, deepening the mystery and pulling it further from the explanations anyone had once considered safe. When Mark's boat was finally brought out of the water and set in dry dock for a full forensic inspection, investigators approached it with the hope that, up close and without the distraction of shifting seas, the vessel might give up some of its secrets. In the stillness of the shipyard, the boat looked almost ordinary, just another working craft weathered by years on the Atlantic. But under the forensic lights, subtle details began to emerge. Along the starboard side, faint but measurable scrape marks ran in a pattern parallel to the waterline. They weren't the kind made by drifting against a dock or rubbing a buoy. The angles and depth suggested sustained contact with another hull. The marine paint on the scrapes was chipped in a way that indicated compression, as though the two vessels had been pressed together with force, then pulled apart. Some marks were wide and flat, others narrow and sharp-edged, hinting that the other craft might not have been the same size or design as Mark's. Technicians took paint samples from the abrasions, hoping to identify the type and perhaps the origin of the other vessel, but early tests came back inconclusive. The pigment was a generic marine-grade coating used on countless boats, making it impossible to narrow down without more distinctive identifiers. Inside the cabin, most surfaces were clean, if a little salt-stained from years of work at sea. But as one technician swept a beam of light across the cabin door, something faint caught the reflection, a partial handprint, barely visible in the residue left behind by salt spray. It was positioned near the latch, where someone would naturally reach to pull the door shut. The outline was smudged, as though someone had tried to wipe it away, but enough of the ridge detail remained for lab analysis. When the results came back, they ruled out Mark immediately. The print didn't match any of his known crew members, friends, or family. More surprising was that it didn't match any entries in state or federal criminal databases either. Whoever had left it had no recorded fingerprint on file, at least not under their real identity. The implications were troubling. The scrape marks suggested another boat had come dangerously close enough to make extended hull contact, and the handprint hinted that someone other than Mark had been aboard. But with no eyewitness accounts, no matching fingerprint, and no direct evidence of an altercation, the picture remained maddeningly incomplete. Authorities began to revisit the idea of foul play, though carefully. The fishing community was small, and accusing someone without hard proof risked not only the investigation, but the fragile trust between law enforcement and the people they relied on for information. Still, detectives quietly interviewed other fishermen whose routes might have crossed near Mark's last known position. Most denied seeing any unusual activity. A few admitted they'd noticed an unfamiliar vessel in the area earlier in the month, a low-profile craft with no visible markings, but none could provide enough detail to trace it. Forensic specialists kept going over the boat inch by inch, looking for any overlooked clue. The nets showed no signs of being deliberately cut, but a section of rope from the stern winch was frayed in a way that suggested sudden tension. A cooler near the port bench seat contained a half-empty bottle of water that was missing a cap, the inside coated with a fine layer of salt, as though it had been left open on deck for hours. None of these details proved anything on their own, but together they painted a portrait of a day interrupted, a series of small, inconsistent traces that didn't match the rhythm of an ordinary fishing trip. The case file began to shift in tone. Early pages had been filled with theories about weather, health emergencies, and tragic accidents. Now, the language became more cautious, more speculative. Words like unexplained and unverified contact appeared alongside diagrams of hull positions and fingerprint overlays. Behind closed doors, investigators debated whether to treat the disappearance as a criminal matter, but the absence of a body, a suspect, or even a clear motive kept them from making the leap officially. For Mark's family, the dry dock inspection was another blow. They had hoped the boat might hold an answer, something that could explain why he hadn't come home. Instead, it offered more questions, each one harder to live with than the last. The scrape marks and the ghostly handprint hinted at someone else's presence on that boat, someone who hadn't been there by accident. But without a name or a face, the only certainty was that Mark hadn't been alone out there. And whatever happened after that, the sea had hidden too well for anyone to see. Months after the case had gone cold, when official reports were gathering dust and the harbor talk had shifted to other matters, a man named Daniel Shore requested access to the Coast Guard's archived weather logs from the day Mark vanished. Shore wasn't law enforcement, and he had no family connection to the missing fisherman. He was an independent maritime researcher, the kind who spent more time studying radar patterns and satellite data than actually being on the water. He had been following the Hensley case quietly, and something about the official explanation, or lack of one, didn't sit right with him. The record showed what everyone already knew: calm seas, light winds, stable barometric pressure. No warnings had been issued, no weather anomalies had been broadcast over marine radio. But when Shore began cross-referencing the Coast Guard's logs with raw satellite imagery, from that morning, he noticed something unusual. Over the exact set of coordinates that matched Mark's last known position, there was a brief, tightly concentrated disturbance. It was no larger than a few hundred yards across, a streak of chaos against an otherwise placid ocean. For roughly 8 minutes, wind speed spiked sharply, enough to churn the water into a froth visible from space. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the disturbance dissipated, leaving no lingering storm cells or residual turbulence. The surrounding waters, even just a half-mile away, remained calm, the surface unbroken. To someone without Shore's training, it might have looked like a glitch in the data, but repeated checks of multiple sources confirmed the same pattern. Shore reached out to a contact in the National Weather Service, someone he'd worked with on prior research into microbursts and rogue waves. The contact admitted the phenomenon didn't match any standard classification. Waterspouts, when they occur, tend to form under specific atmospheric conditions that were absent that morning. Rogue waves typically leave some trace in nearby readings, but here there was none. It was, in the contact's words, like a storm that only existed in one place, for one person. Digging deeper, Shore found no evidence that any other vessels in the area had encountered similar conditions. Logbooks from boats working within a few miles of Mark's route all reported calm seas. None of their captains recalled seeing anything on the horizon: no sudden squall, no strange cloud formation, no signs of rough water. It was as if the disturbance had targeted a single spot in the ocean, then vanished before anyone else could notice. When Shore presented his findings to local authorities, the reaction was cautious. While the data was compelling, it wasn't conclusive proof of anything sinister. Still, it was enough to reignite speculation. Some began to wonder if Mark had encountered a rare freak atmospheric event, one that might have thrown his boat off balance or pulled him overboard. Others, less willing to believe in coincidence, floated ideas that strayed into darker territory: experimental military testing, classified operations, or even the presence of an unregistered vessel generating artificial turbulence for unknown reasons. The military angle gained quiet traction in some circles. Maine's coastline, while known for fishing, was also no stranger to naval exercises. Though none were officially recorded for that day, rumors persisted of offshore testing in prior months, operations that never appeared on public schedules. If such testing had been underway, it could explain both the sudden disturbance and the lack of any official acknowledgement. But without a witness or a whistleblower, it was speculation layered on speculation. Shore himself refused to commit to any single theory. In interviews, he described the anomaly as a gap in the narrative, a missing chapter in the story of Mark's disappearance. He emphasized that while the disturbance could have been natural, its precision and brevity made it an outlier in maritime records. "Things like this don't just happen in isolation," he told one local paper, "unless something or someone made them happen." For Mark's family, the discovery was a strange kind of torment. It was new information, yes, but it brought them no closer to answers. The idea that the ocean had momentarily turned violent in one exact place, and only for long enough to swallow a man whole, was as chilling as it was incomprehensible. It suggested a force at work that morning, whether natural or human-made, that no one had anticipated and no one had been able to stop. And if that force could appear without warning, it could just as easily appear again. It was during a quiet evening at Mark's family home, weeks after the discovery of the strange weather anomaly, that his older brother, Thomas, mentioned something he hadn't thought about in years. They had been teenagers then, working summers on the docks, when a fisherman named Alan Brewer had gone missing in nearly the same stretch of water where Mark had vanished. The memory came back to him in fragments: the murmur of worried voices on the pier, the Coast Guard cutters returning empty-handed, and the sight of Brewer's boat being towed in, nets dragging like limp arms behind it. The more Thomas spoke, the more the parallels felt unsettling. Brewer's disappearance in 1983 had carried details eerily similar to Mark's. Calm seas. No distress call. His vessel found with nets half deployed, the catch inside still fresh enough to suggest he'd been working moments before whatever happened took him. And, like Mark, no body was ever recovered. At the time, the town had chalked it up to the sea claiming one of its own, a tragedy, but not an inexplicable one. People accepted it because the ocean had always taken without explanation. Thomas's recollection gnawed at investigators enough for them to dig into old records. The Brewer file, yellowed and brittle at the edges, was stored in a climate-controlled archive in the county building. It was sparse compared to modern standards. Handwritten statements, black and white photographs, and typewritten reports that left wide gaps in the narrative. But one entry in the incident log stood out. It described objects retrieved from the net inconsistent with known marine life. There was no photograph of these objects, no detailed description beyond that cryptic phrase. When they checked the evidence inventory, the file listed a small sealed container logged into the property room in August of 1983. Yet, when they cross-referenced with the current evidence database, the container was nowhere to be found. The records showed no transfer, no destruction order, no sign-out log. It had simply vanished, leaving only its mention in the report as proof it had ever existed. Retired officers who'd worked the case were contacted, but few remembered much about the objects. One man recalled hearing that the items were organic, but wrong somehow, a phrase so vague it could mean almost anything. Another said he thought they were plant matter tangled with bits of metal, though he admitted his memory might be faulty after so many years. None could explain why the evidence had disappeared, and those who might have known for certain had either passed away or moved on long ago. The similarities between Brewer's case and Mark's began to draw attention among the current investigative team. Two disappearances, decades apart, in nearly the same location, both involving boats left in mid-operation. In each, the sea had given back pieces of the vessel, but not the man. And now, both carried a strange, unresolved detail. In Brewer's case, the inconsistent objects. In Mark's, the railing section with knots no one could identify. Some in law enforcement hesitated to link the two officially, wary of opening an investigative path built on old memories and missing evidence. But for those close to the Hensley family, the connection was impossible to ignore. It suggested that whatever happened to Mark might not have been an isolated incident, but part of something longer, stranger, and far less understood. The missing container became an obsession for one detective who spent days combing through outdated evidence ledgers and internal memos, searching for any clue about its fate. The deeper he looked, the more irregularities surfaced, other old cases with small gaps in their evidence chains, occasional notes about items misplaced or sent to external agencies without clear follow-up. Whether this pointed to bureaucratic error, deliberate removal, or something more troubling was impossible to determine. When Thomas learned that the container was gone, he felt a weight settle in his chest. It wasn't just the loss of a potential lead. It was the realization that the past had been trying to warn them, and no one had listened. In 1983, a man had vanished under circumstances almost identical to Mark's, and something pulled from his nets had raised enough questions to be logged, and then quietly erased. For the family, it was both a clue and a curse. It gave them a thread to pull on, but the other end of it had been cut decades ago. The unanswered question of what those objects were and why they'd vanished from an evidence room now joined the growing list of mysteries surrounding Mark's fate, pushing the story further into a realm where the lines between accident, crime, and something neither could fully explain began to blur. It was early spring when the call came in. A voice over the radio from the Silver Dawn, a commercial trawler working more than 50 miles offshore, in waters so deep they were rarely fished. The crew had been hauling in a heavy net that snagged on something deep below, forcing them to slow the winch and work the line carefully. At first, they thought they'd hooked part of a wreck. The net bulged and dragged with an uneven weight, but as the mass broke the surface, dripping and dark, the deck fell silent. Tangled among torn mesh and strands of seaweed was a shape no one on board could mistake for debris. The crew lowered the net onto the deck and began cutting away sections to see what they had pulled up. Under layers of barnacles and encrusted growth was something pale, rigid, and unmistakably human. It was a torso, partial, severed at the waist and shoulders, wrapped tightly in thick rope knotted in the same intricate pattern that had been found on the fragment of Mark Hensley's railing months earlier. The rope was so tightly bound that it had cut deep grooves into the flesh, grooves that had hardened in place over time. By the time the Coast Guard arrived to transfer the remains, word had already reached shore. When the trawler docked, the harbor was lined with onlookers, their faces pale as the covered stretcher was wheeled away. Forensic teams moved quickly, knowing the condition of the remains could offer rare clues. The barnacles and marine growth on the rope suggested long-term submersion, but the body itself told a different story. DNA testing confirmed within days what everyone already feared. The torso belonged to Mark Hensley. Yet the state of the remains raised more questions than it answered. Despite months in the ocean, the skin showed none of the tearing, discoloration, or soft tissue loss typical of bodies left unprotected in salt water. There were no bite marks from fish or crabs, no signs of scavenging at all. It was as though the body had been shielded from the marine environment entirely, preserved in a way that defied the conditions in which it was found. Pathologists were baffled. They estimated Mark had been dead for months, consistent with his disappearance, but the preservation suggested he had been kept in an environment isolated from the ocean, possibly a sealed container, before ending up in the net. The absence of marine predation, coupled with the distinctive knotted rope, pointed toward deliberate handling. This was not a man who had simply fallen overboard and drifted into the deep. Investigators immediately drew connections to the earlier discovery of the railing fragment and the knotted rope, noting the identical knot patterns and fiber composition. They re-examined photographs of the knots, consulting maritime historians and even anthropologists in an attempt to trace their origin. A few identified similarities to old deepwater trap designs used by certain fishing cultures over a century ago, though no one could explain how such a technique would resurface now or why it would be used to bind a body. The location of the discovery was another puzzle. The Silver Dawn had been operating far outside the area where Mark had last been seen. Currents in the region were well mapped. For his remains to have drifted there naturally would have required an improbable series of movements. Some experts argued he had been transported intentionally, perhaps dropped from another vessel long after his death. Mark's family received the news in private before it was released publicly. For them, the confirmation was both an ending and a new kind of torment. They finally knew he was gone, but the manner of his return only deepened the mystery. His wife refused to look at photographs of the rope, saying she already knew what it meant, that someone had taken him, kept him, and then discarded him in a place where they never expected he would be found. The official report on the remains was written in careful clinical language, avoiding speculation. But off the record, several investigators admitted they believed foul play was now almost certain. The problem was proving it. There were no witnesses, no suspects, and no clear motive. The sea had returned part of Mark Hensley, but it had also erased the trail that might have led to whoever had put him there. The net that pulled him from the depths had changed everything. What had once been a missing person case, clouded by uncertainty and theory, was now anchored by the reality of a body, one that bore signs of deliberate confinement, rope work from another time, and a journey through the ocean that made no natural sense. And somewhere out there, in the dark miles beyond the shore, was the rest of him, and the answer to what had happened on that calm September morning. The autopsy began with the hope that the body might finally tell the story the ocean had refused to give up. But from the first examination, the pathologists realized this was not going to be a straightforward case. The partial remains of Mark Hensley were remarkably well preserved for someone who had supposedly spent months in the Atlantic. There was no decomposition in the way they expected, no signs of the sea life that typically leaves its mark on a body adrift. Instead, the skin was oddly intact, and along both sides of the torso ran deep symmetrical indentations, precise, evenly spaced lines, almost like the impressions from a lattice or rigid grid pressed against the flesh for an extended period. The grooves were so uniform they seemed mechanical rather than accidental. When they opened the chest cavity, they found evidence of drowning. The lungs contained salt water, but it was not consistent with direct ocean exposure. Microscopic analysis revealed an anomaly. Traces of fresh water mixed in with the saline, a combination that shouldn't occur naturally. One forensic specialist suggested this could mean Mark had been submerged in a contained source of water before ending up in the sea, something like a tank, a vat, or a holding enclosure, and that he had drowned there, not in the open ocean. The theory was disturbing, not only because it pointed toward confinement, but because it implied someone had controlled exactly where and how he died. Attention turned to the rope. Every strand binding the torso was a synthetic match to the line found months earlier, tangled with the fragment of his boat's railing. The knotwork was identical, intricate, methodical, and utterly foreign to modern fishing practice in the region. Maritime historians were consulted, and after weeks of review, one archivist traced the design to illustrations in a century-old collection of deep-water trap schematics. These traps, once used in certain isolated fishing communities, were designed for long-term submersion and could hold their contents intact for weeks. The fact that the same knotting appeared on a modern crime scene was something no one could explain. The implications unsettled the investigative team. Whoever had bound Mark's body had knowledge of a knotting technique so obscure it had vanished from common use generations ago. And if the body had been kept in a confined space before being placed in the ocean, then every step, from the moment he disappeared to the day he was found, had been intentional. It was at this stage, quietly and without public announcement, that the FBI stepped in. Agents arrived under the official line of maritime jurisdictional interest, but their presence changed the tone of the investigation immediately. Interviews with the pathologists were repeated, chain of custody logs were audited line by line, and all photographic evidence was duplicated and sealed. No one in the local department could say exactly what federal investigators believed they were dealing with, but the shift in control was unmistakable. The FBI's interest in the century-old knot design was particularly intense. Agents requested copies of all maritime archive references, then asked for lists of anyone in the state or neighboring states who might have studied or used antique fishing techniques. This was a narrow pool. Retired fishermen in their 80s and 90s, maritime museum staff, and a handful of nautical history hobbyists. Whether any of these names became persons of interest was never shared. Mark's family was told little. The official statements stuck to clinical facts: cause of death undetermined, evidence of drowning, time of death estimated but inconclusive. Privately, they were warned that the investigation had expanded in scope and might take months, even years, to resolve. His wife found herself replaying the details she'd been given: the strange indentations on his skin, the presence of fresh water in his lungs, the rope from another era, trying to fit them into a picture that made sense. None of it did. In the harbor, rumors began again, fed by the sight of federal agents asking questions and boarding vessels without warning. Some believed the knots and rope hinted at an old, dangerous tradition that had never truly died out. Others said the preservation of the body suggested refrigeration or chemical treatment, something industrial, hidden away far from shore. A few whispered about darker possibilities, the kind of theories that never reached the newspapers but spread quickly over drinks in the back corner of the bar. What the pathologists had hoped would be the final word on Mark's fate had instead opened a deeper, more complex mystery. The body had given them facts: the grid-like marks, the fresh water in his lungs, the historical knotting, but no answers. And now, with the FBI holding the case files, even those closest to the investigation began to wonder if the truth of what happened to Mark Hensley was about to be buried under something far larger than a missing fisherman's story. When the final report was issued, it read like the conclusion to a story no one in Mark Hensley's family recognized. The state's finding was brief and clinical. Cause of death listed as drowning, manner accidental. There was no mention of the intricate rope knots, no acknowledgement of the unexplained atmospheric disturbance over his last known location, no explanation for the unusual preservation of his remains. Those details, the ones that had kept investigators and federal agents turning over theories for months, were absent. To the family, it felt less like a resolution and more like a decision to stop asking questions. The press release framed it as closure, a tragic accident at sea, the kind that could happen to anyone working dangerous waters. But for the people who had followed the case from the beginning, it was a conclusion that didn't match the evidence. Mark's wife refused to sign off on the statement. She kept a binder of every report, every photograph, and every clipped news article in her living room, determined that if the official record wouldn't hold the truth, she would. His brother called it what it was, a quiet burial of the investigation. In the harbor, the mood shifted. The coordinates where Mark's remains had been found, once just another patch of working ocean, became a place to avoid. Some fishermen claimed they didn't want to work so far out, that fuel costs made it impractical. Others admitted they didn't like the feeling out there, that the water seemed off in ways they couldn't put into words. Crews who'd spent decades unbothered by the superstitions of the trade now gave that stretch a wide berth. Among the few who still ventured near, the talk was quieter. They spoke about the knots in the rope, patterns none of them used or had even seen, and about how the currents didn't seem right around that area. A few recalled the old 1983 disappearance of Alan Brewer, noting how similar it was to Mark's, and how that case had also been quietly filed away without a clear explanation. A year passed. Mark's family learned to live with the official silence, even as they refused to accept it. His wife still walked the dock some evenings, scanning the horizon as if expecting to see him step off a returning boat. His daughter, now married, kept his photograph on a side table near the front door, a small reminder of the man who should have been there to walk her down the aisle. Then, in late spring, a deep-water longliner working far offshore reported a strange find. While hauling up gear, they retrieved a long length of rope tangled in one of their lines. It was soaked, frayed at the ends, but intact enough to show the same distinctive knotting found on Mark's body and on the section of his boat's railing. The crew recognized it immediately. The story of the Hensley knots had traveled through every dockside bar and gear shop in the region. This time, though, the rope was empty. There was no metal fragment, no bone, no trace of anything that might explain its purpose. When the rope was turned over to authorities, it disappeared into the same procedural fog as the rest of the evidence. No public statement was made. The family heard about it only through a friend who knew someone on the crew. Quiet inquiries to the state police went unanswered, and the Coast Guard declined to confirm the discovery at all. The FBI, which had once shown such interest in the case, offered no comment. It was as though the find had been dropped into a well and the surface smoothed over. For the fisherman, it was confirmation that whatever had taken Mark, whatever had left him bound in knots from another time, was not finished. The rope was proof that the thing they feared was still out there, working in waters they now treated like a graveyard. Boats continued to give the coordinates a wide berth, not because they believed in curses, but because some part of them believed in patterns, and this pattern was one they wanted no part of. Officially, the file remains closed. Unofficially, in the minds of those who knew him, the story isn't over. The sea may have returned part of Mark Hensley, but it had also kept its silence, holding back whatever truth had moved through those calm waters on the day he vanished. And in the quiet spaces of the harbor, where the tide slaps against the pilings and the gulls cry overhead, the question lingers. If the ocean has given back the rope, what else is still waiting below?